So the last thing we were talking about was one context of the New Testament called the Greco-Roman world. And so in that lecture, we saw that it's important to place the New Testament, these 27 documents, in their own historical context. If you really want to understand the New Testament, you have to understand that time period from the year 300 BCE, from Alexander the Great, down to 300 CE, the time of the first Christian emperor Constantine. The other context that's important is the world of ancient Judaism, which is actually a subsection of the Greco-Roman world. It's part of that context. And so we're going to look at that context here in this lecture. And before you listen to this lecture, make sure you've read through Ehrman's chapter on ancient Judaism. Even though ancient Judaism is sometimes portrayed, even by really good scholars, as being completely different, unique, unlike anything any other religion in its environment was like. If you step back and think about ancient Judaism for a moment, what you should realize is that that's not true. Judaism is not entirely unique, nor is Christianity unique. They might have differences from Greco-Roman religions, but there's also a lot of similarities. In fact, in the case of ancient Judaism, if it were completely different, if it were unique, no one could have recognized it as a religion. Greeks and Romans wouldn't have looked at Judaism and said, that looks similar to certain things we do, certain things we practice. So if you think about this for a moment, imagine how you would describe something like an iPhone or an iPad to a person who's never seen an iPhone or an iPad before, or to someone who didn't know what smartphones and smartpads are. What if you were talking to someone from a part of the world that didn't even know this type of technology existed? That's what it would have been like if Judaism was something that was unique or utterly different, totally different. But the reality is, ancient Judaism had a number of points of contact, broad points of similarity with other religions of the Greco-Roman world. So if we were comparing Judaism to some of the pagan traditions that we talked about in the last lecture, just like them, the Jews believed in a divine realm. They believed in a divine realm that was inhabited by one supreme deity, one supreme God. But they also, and this is important, even though Jews are monotheists, it's also important to note that Jews believed there were other divine beings in that divine realm. They just were not as powerful as the one supreme God. Many Jews in the world of ancient Judaism believed in things, or in entities or creatures such as angels and archangels and demons. That was all part of the divine supernatural world. Like their pagan counterparts, Jews had sacred places that were devoted to the worship of their one God. These were places where you went and offered sacrifices. These were places you would go to and pray and go through various practices and liturgies. I mean, in a sense, the religion of ancient Judaism is going to look like a cult. It's going to look like a cultus deorum. That Latin phrase, care of the gods, to anyone who's looking at it from the outside. Like their pagan counterparts, ancient Jews saw worship as principally involving ritual practices. Again, as I said, animal sacrifices existed in ancient Judaism. Prayers were done in accordance with various traditions. All of this was done in order to propitiate or appease the one true God and to demonstrate devotion to that one true God. And like their pagan counterparts, most Jews were more concerned with life in the present than with life after death or the afterlife. For Jews, God was the God of this world, and that God was concerned about how people followed him in the here and now, not in the next world, not in the afterlife. In other words, you didn't just appease this God or follow this God in order to gain entrance into heaven. That wasn't the major purpose of the faith or of the religion. Yet, having said all of that, there were significant differences between Jews and everyone else in the ancient world. Even though a lot of ancient Judaism and the practices of ancient Judaism looked like things the Greeks and the Romans were doing, Jews did things that really did separate them from the Greco-Roman world. To understand Judaism more fully, what we really need to do is talk about these areas of distinctiveness. The areas of similarity, those are obvious, but the important things are the distinctive things that when we compare and contrast Judaism and Greco-Roman cults, Greco-Roman religions, we do start to see some things that say, well, this wasn't exactly the same thing. So, the most important, the most distinct thing, or the most distinctive feature of ancient Judaism, in contrast to all the various forms of paganism that we've talked about, is the fact that Judaism is monotheistic. Some Greeks and Romans, and we've already talked about this, but some Greeks and Romans thought there was one God who was above all the other gods and goddesses. This could be Zeus if you're a Greek, this could be Jupiter if you're a Roman. But Jews took this further. For a Jew, being a monotheist meant there is only one true deity. There is only one true God. And only that God is to be taken care of. Only that God is to be worshipped and served. There can be other supernatural beings, angels, archangels, demons, but they're not at all a god or a goddess. They're not at that level. So the one true God of the universe for the Jews is a God called Yahweh, Yahweh. And that God is the God who's to be worshipped and served. That God, Yahweh, is the God who created the universe, created the world, created human beings. Yahweh was more powerful than all the other gods, which were widely thought to exist, even among the Jews, but they just weren't on the same level. Again, there was only one true creator God. What also makes Yahweh distinct is that Yahweh is not the God of a particular location or locality. He wasn't the God of a forest or the God of a mountain. Now, he might have, if you look at ancient Jewish religion, especially ancient Israelite religion, he might have started out as a local deity of the land of Judah. But when we get to the time of the New Testament, and we get to this period of Greco-Roman history from 300 BCE to 300 CE, Yahweh has become the creator of the world, the creator of the universe even. And Jews thought that Yahweh was so holy, so distinct from everything else, that you couldn't even pronounce his name. So Jews in the ancient world, like many modern Jews, would never pronounce the name of their God. They would never say Yahweh. Instead, what they would do is spell out his name. The name of Yahweh is made up of 4 consonants, YHWH, these 4 letters. It's called the Tetragrammaton. This is God's personal name, but you don't pronounce it. Some Jews even won't write it out. And this particular deity is the only God that is to be worshipped. So though other gods, goddesses, other divine beings might exist, they did not create the universe. They were all created by Yahweh. And none of them are to be worshipped except for this God, this one true deity, this one true being. In fact, Jews believed that their God had made a covenant with them. A covenant is a treaty or a pact. And what Jews believed, even during the time of Jesus, even many Jews down to this day, is that Yahweh made a covenant with their ancestors and with the Jewish people. He separated them from the rest of the inhabitants of the earth. Yahweh agreed to protect the Jews and honor the Jews, so long in return as they agreed to worship him and behave as he had instructed them. So this was kind of a quid pro quo thing. You honor me, God is saying, and I will take care of you. This covenant, if you go back to the Old Testament, to the Jewish Bible, to the Hebrew Bible, this covenant was first made with the father of the Jews, a man named Abraham. Next, it was confirmed under the great Jewish leader Moses, who became the savior of Israel, getting them out of slavery in the land of Egypt, freeing them from Pharaoh. After Moses led the ancient Israelites on the exodus out of Egypt, Yahweh came and gave Moses the law of Yahweh, the law of God at Mount Sinai. The law of God, also called the law of Moses, represented the obligation of the Jews to Yahweh and what Yahweh would do for the Jews if they obeyed him. This law of the Jews, which is central in ancient Judaism, it's also central to modern Judaism. It came to be embedded in all kinds of different writings. These writings now make up what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews might call the Hebrew Bible or call the Torah. The first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible consist of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Collectively, these books are known in Judaism as the Torah, Torah. The Hebrew word Torah, or Torah as it's pronounced in Hebrew, simply means in English, the law of God or the teachings of God. Originally, these 5 books would have been 5 scrolls. If you go into a Jewish synagogue today, there will be symbolic scrolls at the front of the synagogue in a place called the Ark where they're housed. Sometimes Christians refer to the Torah as the Pentateuch or the 5 books. Now, in the modern world, Christians have sometimes misunderstood the importance of the law in Judaism. For a Jew, the law is not a negative thing. It's not something you need to be saved from. It makes no sense to a modern Jew even to hear a Christian say, I need to be saved by grace, not by the law. Because the law, back in the ancient world and now in the modern world, the law of Judaism, the Torah, is a positive thing. It was never meant, in other words, to be this onerous, undoable list of do this and don't do that. Otherwise, you're going to hell. That's not how the law works in Judaism. For Jews, both ancient and modern, the law is seen as the greatest gift God has ever given anyone. It's not just the law of God, it's the teachings of Yahweh. It's the teachings of the one true God of the universe. It shows people how to worship God, what it means to actually live together with God. And for both ancient and modern Jews, following the Torah, following the law of God, this is the greatest possible joy a Jew could engage in. Because if you follow the law, it meant and it means that you're yielding yourself as a Jew to the all-powerful and loving God who created the entire universe and who called the Jewish people out of bondage in Egypt to freedom and gave them a homeland. To put this as clearly as I can, for a Jew, both ancient and modern, following the law isn't a requirement for what we might call salvation. It's a response to the fact that you've already been saved by God. Now, included in the law of the Jews were things like the Ten Commandments, which Christians are also familiar with. There were also not just the Ten Commandments, but laws designed to make the Jewish people distinct from others that they might encounter. Just to give you a couple of examples here. The Jewish law, the Torah, says that Jews are to circumcise their baby boys. Well, that's going to make them different from other individuals, especially the Greeks and Romans that they live among. The Jewish law also says Jews do not work on the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. Well, in the ancient world, especially in the Roman Empire, people worked 7 days a week. This was an unusual thing when Greeks and Romans encountered Jews and suddenly 1 day a week they weren't working. In fact, this led to all kinds of animosity. The Romans thought the Jews were just lazy. The Jews were also told about kosher laws, Kosher. In other words, food laws. There are certain things a Jew can eat and certain things Jews cannot eat. So for example, a Jew is told in the law you cannot eat pork and you cannot eat shrimp, which separates them even further from the people they live among. One other distinct feature of ancient Judaism is the temple of Yahweh in the city of Jerusalem. The Temple of Jerusalem was the one and only temple that you could go to truly worship Yahweh and to sacrifice to Yahweh and to pay homage to Yahweh. It was this, and this is the picture you're looking at here is a model of it. This is not what it actually looked like because it's not standing anymore. But it was this magnificent, glorious place in the days of Jesus back in the first century. Just to give you an idea of how massive this structure was, it was large enough to encompass 25 football fields. And it was so expensive because most of it was overlaid with gold. And again, as I said, this was the place you would go to if you were a Jew to offer animal sacrifices to the one true God. This is the place you would go to as a Jew. This is where you wanted to make a pilgrimage to at least once in your life if you were a Jew, to show your devotion to Yahweh, to express it. Now, because animal sacrifices were so much a part of ancient Jewish religion, the temple became a central place for all Jewish worship, no matter where you lived throughout the Greco-Roman world. And this is why it ends up being located in Jerusalem. This is why Jerusalem is the capital of Judea. It is the central city. It is the central focus of ancient Jews. Just like Mecca or Medina are important places in Islam today, Jerusalem in the ancient world and Jerusalem in the modern world are very, very important sites, is a very important site for Jews. And so during the time of Jesus, even before that, Jews would flock from all over the Greco-Roman world to worship at the temple of Yahweh. And this would often happen during very important, prominent Jewish festivals like the festival or feast of Passover. Having said that, most Jews in the first century CE did not live in Jerusalem, nor did they live in Palestine. Most Jews were scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world, throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Mediterranean world. A lot of this happened because if you look at the history of ancient Judaism, the Jews were being conquered left and right by the Babylonians, by the Greeks, by the Romans, and every time they were conquered by foreign powers, they were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. Because of this, and because the temple was so remote from most Jews, Jews living, even some living in the land of Palestine, but Jews certainly living outside in the Roman Empire, they created these things called synagogues. These were local places of worship. In fact, the word synagogue comes from a Greek term meaning a gathering together or a gathering place. And Jews today still largely meet in synagogues. Synagogues were prominent during the time of Jesus and the time of the New Testament writers. In fact, we'll see shortly here that Jesus spent time in synagogues. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, he's said to have preached a very important sermon in a synagogue. What's important to note, though, is when we talk about ancient Judaism, when we talk about Judaism in the time of the first century, even though I'm putting a bunch of things, ideas, beliefs, etc. here together, early Judaism, ancient Judaism, even like modern Judaism, is not monolithic. What I mean by that is even though we can see basic patterns in early or ancient Judaism, there is no such thing as one Judaism in the first century CE. So if you ask the question, well, what does a Jew believe in the first century? Like anything, it's like asking that about Christians today. It depends on which Jew or group of Jews you're talking to. There might be common things, for example, that Protestant Christians and Catholic Christians agree on, but there's also a lot of differences. And the same thing is true of ancient Jews. There were, in fact, many kinds of Jews in the first century. And they believed different things and they practiced their religion differently. They interpreted this law of God in a very, very different way. The easiest way to illustrate this is to talk about the variety of Judaisms that existed in the first century. And there are more than the four I'm going to talk about here, but the four major groups of Jews, or the four major groups of Judaism that existed at the time of Jesus, were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and something called the fourth philosophy. Now, most Jews did not belong to any of these four groups. And it's important to realize that when I talk about these groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, the fourth philosophy, these aren't denominations. It's not like we're talking about Christian denominations like Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Baptists, etc. What Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and the fourth philosophy, what they're more like is local civic organizations, like the Elks or the Chambers of Commerce or the Rotary Clubs. Some people belong to them and most people don't. But these four groups are useful to examine and to understand, mainly because in one way, shape, or form, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, they appear in the New Testament writings. But they also reveal some of the diversity that exists in ancient Judaism. So let's start with the most prominent and best known group. And that is a group of Jews in the ancient world called the Pharisees. Pharisees existed not only in Palestine, where Jesus is from, but outside of it in the larger Roman Empire. In fact, one of the most famous Christians, Paul, calls himself a Pharisee. Contrary to everything that modern people think of when they think of Pharisees, the Pharisees are not hypocrites. For various reasons, if you opened up Webster's Dictionary, or you opened up to the entry Pharisees in the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the definitions you would get for Pharisee is a hypocrite. If you call somebody Pharisaical in the English language, you're basically saying that person is a hypocritical person. That is not a good characterization of the Pharisees at all. It's a misrepresentation of them. The Pharisees were a very committed group of Jews who believed in following the Torah, the law of Yahweh. They wanted to follow it as far as possible. They wanted to be as righteous and holy as possible. They even devised another law to go along with the written law of God, an oral law. The oral law of the Pharisees basically became their interpretation of the written law. And they did this to help them better understand some of the ambiguities that exist in the law of Moses or the law of Yahweh. Over time, the oral laws and the debates of the Pharisees were written down by later Jewish rabbis, Jewish teachers, around the year 200 or so, in a book that Jews today call the Mishnah. Mishnah. In fact, that Hebrew word Mishnah simply means oral law or a retelling of the written law. And the Mishnah today is the heart of a very large collection of Jewish lore and teaching called the Talmud. And the Pharisees are responsible for this. In fact, the Pharisees are really responsible for what we today would think of as modern Judaism. This was a group of Jews that were far from hypocritical. Instead, this was a group of Jews that took the teachings of Moses, the teachings of Yahweh, so seriously that they came up with extensive commentary on those teachings and on those laws. In fact, their religious outlook was an outlook that stressed the importance of living by the law of God and thinking about and debating the finer points of the law of God or the Torah. A second group that we encounter in the New Testament along with the Pharisees is a group of individuals known as the Sadducees. These were the priests in ancient Judaism. These were the ones who would be offering sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. And they were often opposed to the Pharisees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees did not get along. One of the big things that distinguishes the Sadducees from the Pharisees is that the Sadducees do not believe in this oral teaching or this oral law of the Pharisees. For the Sadducees, all you needed was the written law of God. You needed those first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You didn't need anything else. In many respects, the Sadducees were kind of the fundamentalists of ancient Judaism. If it's written down, if that's what God says, that's all we're going to do. Now, unfortunately, from a historical perspective, we're not all that well informed about the Sadducees because, unlike the Pharisees, they didn't leave us any of their own writings. What we do tend to know about them, though, is that they were, as I said, part of the priesthood, but they were also part of the upper class aristocracy of the Jews. You were kind of born into this class. You didn't enter into it from the outside. This might also be why they had so many conflicts with the Pharisees, is people from lower class standings could get educated and enter into the Pharisaic group, but not so much with the Sadducees. The other thing is because they were part of the upper class aristocracy and they were part of the priesthood, they were often looked down upon by other Jews because they often compromised with the Romans. It was in their best interests in some cases to compromise with the Romans. So, in fact, we'll see this in the New Testament writings of many have thought that the Sadducees were in cahoots with the Romans and vice versa, that it was advantageous for these two groups to work together. And it looks like, if you do a very, very careful reading, especially of the passion narrative of Jesus and the end of his life, that it's the Sadducees who, along with the Romans, who really want him removed, who want him killed, who want him crucified. So the religious outlook of the Sadducees is an outlook that stresses the temple of God. That's the most important thing. Forget the synagogues, forget the oral law. The Sadducees focused on the temple in Jerusalem, which was their livelihood. They focused on performing animal sacrifices to God as prescribed in the written laws. The third group is a group called the Essenes. Now, this group doesn't directly appear, nor is it named in the New Testament, but some of their ideas and beliefs show up in the New Testament. The Essenes were a group of highly religious Jews who believed that the rest of the people of Israel, that the rest of the Jews had fallen away from God. And they believed that all of these other Jews were impure. They were just simply wrong. If you want to think of it this way, they were a breakaway group of Jews who said, we're right. Everyone else has no idea what they're doing and no idea what they're talking about. The Essenes worked to preserve their own purity, apart from all the impure Jews around them. Sometimes this led to founding their own monastic communities where they lived together and worshiped God in the way that they thought God was to be worshipped. Probably the most important community of Essenes is a place called Qumran, Qumran. Qumran is where a number of the Jewish Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It's a library of the Essene community, and it was discovered in the 20th century in the year 1947. In their religious outlook, the Essenes stressed the need to be pure. And the reason they did this is because what they believed is that the world as we know it was soon going to come to a crashing halt. It was going to end. They thought and firmly believed that God was going to intervene in history and overthrow the forces of evil. If you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you realize is that the Essenes thought they were going to survive this judgment of God. The Romans would not, and any Jews who were not on their side, they were going to be judged and destroyed along with the Romans. The Essenes were, and I'll talk about this a bit more here in a moment, they're a great example of apocalyptic Jews. Jews who believed that God would intervene in the space-time continuum and judge the world, throw out the bad people and keep the good people. The fourth group is a group that scholars call the fourth philosophy. This was a group of bandits, a group of troublemakers, even a terrorist-style group. Briefly, this group comprises a number of groups of Jews who believed that God had given them the land of Israel, the land of Palestine, by divine right. And they thought, look, we don't need to wait around for God to kick out the Romans. We don't need to wait around for a new kingdom of the Jews to be established in our homeland. We just need to take it by force. We need to make this happen for ourselves. So members of the fourth philosophy engaged in terrorist tactics. They would target certain Roman individuals who were high up in the government. They would assassinate them. They would kill them. They would, if they had access to things like suicide bombs and all that sort of stuff, they would have used them. Their whole ethos, in other words, was to take their land back by force from the Romans. So these four groups, I mean, it shows you the diversity here. You have the very pious and religious Pharisees, you have the priesthood of the Sadducees, you have a split-off group called the Essenes that thought everybody was doing it wrong. And then you have this bandit group, this terrorist group called the Fourth Philosophy. And this is only a very small sampling of the various Jewish groups that existed in ancient Judaism. All of these groups, what they have in common is they're worshiping the one true God, Yahweh, but they're interpreting their law, the law of God, the law of Moses. They're interpreting their scriptures in a very, very different way. And this is the world of Jesus. Jesus is a Jew. He grows up in this world, and this world is a small part as well of the Greco-Roman world. And all of this is going to collide. Now, as we conclude here, I want to make some remarks about apocalyptic Judaism. As historians have looked back at ancient Judaism, and particularly at the writings of the New Testament, one kind of ancient Jewish perspective has provided particularly important understanding for the historical Jesus and for the New Testament writings in general. And that type of Judaism is something called apocalyptic Judaism or Jewish apocalypticism. So I want to spend a few moments on this as we close out, because this is going to come up again and again and again in the New Testament. In fact, just to preview this for you, one of the arguments that historians have made, and I definitely think this is true, is that the historical Jesus himself, if you ask, well, which group of Jews did he belong to? The answer is he was an apocalyptic Jew. I think all of the early Christians, particularly Paul, who wrote all these letters in the New Testament, he and these other early Christians, they too were apocalyptic Jews. And to truly understand the New Testament writings, you really have to understand apocalyptic Judaism and how it works in the world of ancient Judaism. We know about this particular form of Judaism, which has a particular worldview, from all kinds of Jewish sources. In the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, there's this book called the Book of Daniel, which is supposedly written by the prophet Daniel. It really is not a prophetic book. It is an apocalyptic book. And we'll talk about it later on in this course. But if you read Daniel, that is a good example of an apocalyptic Jewish work. We also have some non-biblical Jewish books from the time of Jesus, Paul, and the other New Testament writers. We have something called the Book of 1 Enoch, which is a very apocalyptic text, which perfectly describes apocalyptic Judaism. There are also so many of the writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls are apocalyptic. And again, the Essenes are apocalyptic Jews. When you start talking about judgment and all those sorts of things in your writings, you are talking about apocalyptic Judaism. So from Daniel to 1 Enoch to the Dead Sea Scrolls, apocalyptic Judaism was a widespread form of Jewish practice and belief. And this practice and belief held to by all kinds of thinkers, whether it was the Pharisees or the Essenes, has some major tenets to it. We can look at the book of Daniel, we can look at some of the New Testament writings, we can look at 1 Enoch, we can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and say, oh, this is what apocalyptic Jews basically believed. So the major tenets of apocalyptic Judaism are these. First of all, if you're an apocalyptic Jew, or if you're an apocalypticist in general, what you typically do is you hold to a concept of dualism. You have, in other words, a dualistic understanding of the world. What I mean by that is if you're a dualist, there are two fundamental forces of reality. There are the forces of good and there are the forces of evil. And these two forces are constantly fighting with one another. History itself is seen by apocalyptic Jews as dualistic. The present world that we live in, an apocalypticist will deem the evil age. But the next world, The world that is to come is the good world. It's the good age. And you don't just see this among ancient Jewish writings. Like I said, you see this all the time in the New Testament. The present age is evil. The world that is to come is good. That's apocalyptic thought. The second major tenet is that apocalyptic Jews are pessimists. If you're a good apocalypticist, you think that life in this world cannot be improved by any human effort. Things are getting worse. But in a sense, that's good, because eventually they're going to hit a point where they're going to get better. But you're pessimistic because you believe that the forces of evil are in control, and that these forces are making life worse and worse and worse and worse and worse till it hits a breaking point. Because all of life is a constant struggle between good and evil. The third major tenet, and this is the answer to your pessimism, is that a day of judgment, a day of reckoning is coming. And on that day, you believe as an apocalyptic Jew that your God, Yahweh, will intervene in the world and judge the world and ultimately overthrow the forces of evil. Now, the fourth major tenet is important because this certainly plays a large role in the New Testament writings and in ancient Judaism. If you're an apocalyptic Jew in the ancient world and somebody asks you, well, when is your God going to act? Your response is really, really soon. The coming judgment of Yahweh, the coming judgment of God, in other words, is imminent. It's going to happen in the next couple weeks. You are expecting it to happen. Now, one prominent Jewish apocalypticist, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, put it this way. Truly I tell you, some of you standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God coming in power. As I said, as we continue going through this course, what you're going to discover is that out of the world of ancient Judaism, Jesus, his first followers, and many of the writers of the New Testament, if you're asking, well, where did they fit in the world of ancient Judaism? They fit here. They fit in the world of apocalyptic Judaism.